We have our traditional on-premise network that we're going to reference here. The main purpose of a network is to serve as an isolated space where our networks on-prem can communicate with one another in a private fashion. And also, we can use networks to provide public connectivity to either the internet or outside networks that are not this network itself. Now, we see things on-prem like users accessing file servers within our network. And this is happening in a private fashion on our networks. And then we see things like print sharing with shared printers inside of a network. We also see things like web servers and providing public connectivity to those web servers that are inside of our network as a front end for applications. We also see things like app servers accessing database servers and the internet to serve up applications. And we see this with app servers and databases that are on-prem in the private network communicating with each other. So the main point here is to provide both an isolated network space where resources can communicate privately, but also to provide public connectivity to the outside internet and outside networks in cases in which we want to peer networks between different data centers so that we can have multiple private networks that our organization is using. That is the main goal in networks, and this is how our resources are able to communicate with one another and the internet. Now that we understand the purpose of a network, let's get into comparing our traditional on-premise network with a virtual network inside of the Azure cloud. Now, when we have our network inside of the Azure cloud, we have first our virtual network, and this is a representation of our on-premise network, but in the Azure cloud. And it allows us to do a lot of the same things that we can do in our on-premise networks. We can take this network address space and we can subnet it down into different subnets, breaking it into subnet address spaces that allow us to then put resources like virtual machines inside of this address space. And these virtual machines will have private IP addresses and potentially public IP addresses depending on the IP configurations of the network interface card that is associated with the virtual machine. Now we can also control traffic by allowing or denying specific traffic using network security groups that we can place on the subnet or on the network interface of a resource. And these network security groups can be used to control both the private networking and the public networking traffic that is occurring on this network. And should we decide to provide a public IP address for our resources, we can put a public IP address for these resources and associate it with the configurations on the network interface card so that we have a publicly routable address, so that we're providing both the private networking and the public networking for our virtual network. And what we get by default with our virtual networks is routes that allow access both for public connectivity and routes that allow access for private connectivity within our networks, which is something that we're going to cover in a later lesson in this course where we talk about things like routing for our virtual networks. Now, we see how this compares to our traditional on-prem network. It provides a lot of the same capabilities, but inside of the Azure cloud. It's allowing us to provision a virtual network and abstracting away a lot of the infrastructure portions of that network for us by allowing us to use it as a service. So let's get into describing what a virtual network is at this point. A virtual network is an isolated network space on the Azure cloud that we can utilize to provide private and public addressing for our resources. Now, inside of the Azure cloud, we have this isolated network, and it is isolated specifically from other users of virtual networks inside of the Azure cloud. So we don't have to worry about an issue with our network being the same network as another organization. And what we get is the ability to use the Microsoft backbone to allow us to utilize all of the underlying infrastructure to create our networks without having to provision all of the underlying hardware ourselves that we do on-prem. And again, these virtual networks give us the ability to have private networking access so that the resources within the virtual network can privately communicate with one another, such as things like a virtual machine running a front end of an application and another virtual machine running a back end, or things that are running as platform as a service. We can provide that private network connectivity between those resources so that it doesn't have to transit the public network. And we can also, whenever necessary, provide network integrations that allow us to connect both on-prem networks to our virtual networks inside of the Azure cloud and provide remote user devices to access our virtual networks, much like we do with our road warriors and our on-prem networks by the use of things known as VPN gateways, which we'll cover in a later section in this course. We can also do things like provide connectivity between virtual networks where we peer virtual networks that we have inside of the Azure cloud, and all of this communication can happen over private networking as well. Additionally, we also have the ability to provide public IP addressing for that public network connectivity to the internet so that we can provide things like a public IP that goes to the front end of our applications for our users, and this exists with inside of our virtual networks. Now let's get into talking about the components of a virtual network. What makes up a virtual network? Well, the same thing that makes up our on-premise networks. We have an address space that we determine as the private IP addressing space that we're going to use for our isolated virtual network. And this is going to be the required IP address space that we're going to use to allow the resources within this virtual network to communicate with one another over private IPs. Once we've determined the private IP address space we want to use, we then of course have next our virtual network, which is actually the isolated network on the Azure cloud where our Azure resources like virtual machines are going to be deployed. And then we have inside of these virtual networks our subnets, which are segmentations of the virtual network's address space, and these are really just subnetworks. That's where the term subnet comes from, and this allows us to further isolate networks inside the virtual network where our resources can exist. We might have a virtual machine inside of one subnetwork and then a virtual machine inside of another subnetwork within this virtual network. Now that we've covered the components of virtual networks and we understand what a virtual network is and what makes up a virtual network and the purpose of a virtual network, let's take a look at the key takeaways from this lesson at this point. What we've gathered from this lesson, conceptualizing virtual networks, is that the purpose of a network inside of the Azure cloud is the same of that of a on-premise network. It is an isolated network address space inside of the Azure cloud where our resources can exist. And through this network and the components of the network, we can provide the ability for private network access to allow things like virtual machines inside of our network to communicate, and also allow those resources to communicate with other services inside of the Azure cloud, which is something we'll cover more in a later section of this course when we talk about service endpoints and private link. Then we also have the ability to use these virtual networks to provide network integration between both other virtual networks inside of the Azure cloud, our on-premise networks, and remote user devices using things like peerings and VPN gateways, which we'll also cover in a later section in this course. Alright gurus, that is all my time for now. Thanks so much for joining me in this lesson, and I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson. Hey, and welcome gurus to this lesson, Creating Virtual Networks, where we're going to begin by talking over some of the things that go into designing a network, and then we're going to be talking about the features that we get with virtual networks in the Azure cloud. We're then going to go into our demonstration of creating a virtual network inside of the Azure Cloud Sandbox, and then we're going to wrap up this lesson with some considerations and key takeaways from this lesson. So let's get right into it. When we're designing a network, the very first thing that we need to determine is the IP address space that we want to use for our network. We'll hear this commonly referred to as the IP CIDR, and what we're determining here is the number of available IP addresses for our address space, and we're going to base this off of how big we need this address space to be and how many resources need to exist within this virtual network. Now, once we've decided the IP CIDR of our virtual network, we'll then determine how do we want to segment this IP address space. Do we have specific tiers for our applications in which we want to separate the tiers, such as an application where we have our front end in our virtual machine, and maybe we're using a database tier, and so we segment that database into a separate subnet, allowing us to divide up our network address space in the virtual network and provide different sections for different purposes in our network. Then at this point, we'll determine what our connectivity needs are for a virtual network. Are we going to need to allow specific traffic over the public IP address? Are we going to need to control private IP addressing traffic between our front end of our application and the back end of our application? We need to be able to determine how we want to handle both the public outbound and inbound traffic and the internal inbound and outbound traffic inside of our networks, and we do that with things like routes and network security groups, which we'll cover more as we go through virtual networking in this course. But this is all what goes into planning out and designing a virtual network. We first determine that IP address space we want to use, we subnet the virtual network, and we determine the connectivity needs based off the resources that we plan to deploy inside of that network. Now, this brings us into talking about the features of virtual networks as a service in the Azure cloud. We have the ability to subnet our virtual networks, as we talked about in the previous slide, and this is a familiar concept from on-premise environments where we segment our total IP address space inside of a network. But with Azure Virtual Networks, something that we have to keep in mind is that we have some reserved IP addresses, and these are represented as 5 total IP addresses being the first 4 in the network, with the last octet being 0, 1, 2, or 3, and then the last IP address with the last octet being 255. These 5 total IP addresses are going to be reserved within our network. And next, with our virtual networks, we get private networking, and we get this through private IP assignment for our resources. So each of our resources, like a virtual machine that we provision inside of our virtual network, is going to get its own private IP address, and this is going to be served out from the DHCP server that is built into our virtual network. We don't have to manage that. It's just going to make an IP assignment on our behalf for our resources when we provision them into our virtual network. And then we also have the ability to provide public networking for our resources inside of our virtual network, and this is through the creation of a separate public IP resource, and this supports IPv4 and IPv6 so that we can have public connectivity to our resources inside of our virtual network. And then we have our integration features through things like peers, where we can peer to virtual networks inside of the Azure cloud, and we can peer across things like our regions, and also we can peer within the same region. We'll learn more about peering with virtual networks in a separate section in this course. And then our next integration feature is that of integrating on-prem networks and remote user devices through the use of Azure VPN Gateway. And this is something that we're going to talk about in, again, a separate section where we cover VPN Gateway in this course. For now, it's just important to understand that we have the network integration features for our other virtual networks, our on-prem networks, and remote user devices. And finally, we have our monitoring features of our virtual networks, where we can do things like view logs, monitor connectivity between resources, and view a topology of our virtual network so that we can understand what our virtual network actually looks like and understand where our resources exist inside of that virtual network in a visual aspect. Now that we've talked about the virtual networking features, it's time to get into the demonstration portion of our lesson here. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to use a IP address space like 10.0.0.0/16 to create a virtual network of our own, and we're going to create a default subnet with the IP address space of 10.0.0.0/24, and this is going to be inside of our virtual network, and we're going to name this our default subnet. Then we're going to provision a virtual machine very quickly, and we're going to just review some of the features and capabilities of our virtual network and take a look at how our resource was provisioned a private IP address when it was provisioned inside of this virtual network. Alright, gurus, at this point, let's make our way over to the Azure portal and get started. Alright, gurus, here we are in our Azure Cloud Sandbox with the Cloud Shell already configured with the storage account. And the very first thing that we want to do is create a virtual network. So we'll come up to the search bar and type in virtual networks. We'll select virtual networks under services and we'll click create. We'll minimize this portion of the blade here, and we'll begin configuring this virtual network by selecting our resource group. We'll use the existing resource group for our sandbox. Then we're going to make the name of this virtual network VNet Demo-01. We'll leave the region selection as it is by default, and we'll click next into IP addresses. And here is where we can determine the IP address space for our virtual network, and we see it is listed in CIDR notation, even telling us how many addresses are available inside of that address space. Now, it's going to allow us to use any of the address spaces for private IP addressing in the RFC 1918 standard. You can look that up if you want to determine what IP address you want to use, if you're going to use one different than mine. But I'm going to use the 10.0.0.0.0, and I'm going to make the prefix a /16. Now with our virtual networks, we can go as large of an address space as a /8 and as small as a /29. I'm going to go with that /16, and we see here we could additionally add an IPv6 address space, and I'm not going to be needing that for this, so I'll unselect it. I'll click add subnet because we can create our subnet from here. I'm going to create the default subnet, and I'm going to make the subnet address range at 10.0.0.0/24. And then we're not going to need a NAT gateway or a service endpoint. Those are something that we'll cover in a later. Next into IP addresses. And here is where we can determine the IP address space for a virtual network. And we see it is listed in CIDR notation, even telling us how many addresses are available inside of that address space. Now, it's going to allow us to use Azure Cloud Sandbox. We'll minimize this portion of the blade, use the existing section as it is by default, and we'll click next into even telling us how many addresses are available inside of that address space. Now, it's going to allow us to use any of the address spaces for private IP addressing in the RFC 1918 standard. You can look that up if you want to determine what IP address you want to use, if you're going to use one different than mine. But I'm going to use the 10.0.0.0.0, and I'm going to make the prefix a /16. Now with our virtual networks, we can go as large of an address space as a /8 and as small as a /29. I'm going to go with that /16, and we see here we could additionally add an IPv6 address space, and I'm not going to be needing that for this, so I'll unselect it. I'll click add subnet because we can create our subnet from here. I'm going to create the default subnet, and I'm going to make the subnet address range at 10.0.0.0/24, and then we're not going to need a NAT gateway or a service endpoint. Those are something that we'll cover in a later section in this course. I'll click add, and we'll click next into security. We'll leave all of these settings as they are disabled by default. We'll click review and create, and once it passes validation, we'll click create, and it's going to deploy our virtual network, so we'll be back once it's finished provisioning. Alright, gurus, so we're back and our virtual network has finished deploying, so we'll go into the resource, and right away some of the things we see in the overview are the location that we have for our virtual network as far as the region, the address space that we selected, and the DNS servers, and we're using Azure provided DNS service for our virtual network. Now we also see our connected devices here in the overview, and we don't have any in the results. And what we're going to see inside of the connected devices are things like the network interface cards for a virtual machine that is deployed inside of this virtual network. Now if we go into our settings, obviously again our address spaces that we can see, we can add additional address ranges here, then our connected devices, and then our subnets. And this is another way that we can create our subnets here. We could choose to create another subnet, and we could call this subnet, say, our web subnet here. And we can modify the subnet address range that we want to use here. And we can just click save. And there we've done adding another subnet from a different point in the interface, not necessarily something we created while we were creating the virtual network, something we created post creation of this virtual network. And these subnets are where our resources are going to exist inside of the address space when we deploy them. Now, we also see we have our DNS server settings here, and we can modify these in cases when we want to use custom DNS servers like the Google DNS servers. And if we have any virtual machines within the virtual network, they're going to have to be restarted, and then they'll be able to utilize the updated DNS server settings that we have for our custom DNS. We're going to use the default settings here, and we'll click cancel because we're not going to modify it. And the next thing we're going to do is we're going to create a virtual machine here. We'll type in virtual machine in the search bar. We'll select it under services. We'll click add. We'll click add a virtual machine, and then we'll minimize this portion of the blade. We'll select the resource group we want to use here. We're going to call this the VNet demo VM-01. We're going to leave everything else as it is by default. We're going to use the authentication type of the password. We're going to provide our username here, and then we're going to provide our password. We're going to click next into networking, and we see here we can specify the virtual network, the subnet, and we could modify the subnet, say we want to put it in a different subnet, and whether or not we want to have a public IP address associated with this virtual machine. We're going to let it go into the default subnet with a new public IP address. We'll click review and create. It'll validate, and then we'll click create, and it's going to go and provision our virtual machine. So we'll be back once it has finished provisioning so that we can take a look at how it has affected the virtual network. Alright, so we're back, and our virtual machine has finished provisioning. And now what we're going to do is click on our resource group name here, go into our resource group, and we see we have our virtual machine and its associated resources, but we want to see how it affected our virtual network. So we'll click into our VNet Demo 01, and right away in the overview we see that something has changed in the connected devices. We see we have our new network interface that has a private IP address of the 10.0.0.4, and it is in the default subnet. If we click into this by clicking on the device name of the network interface, what we see is it has a private IP address, again here in the overview. But if we click into the settings on IP configurations, we're going to use the default settings here. Another way that we can create our subnets here, we could choose to create another overview are the endpoint. Those are something that we'll cover in a later section in this course. I'll click add and server settings here, and we can modify settings that validate, and then we'll click create and our virtual machine and its associated resources. But we want to see how it affected our virtual network. So we'll click into our VNet Demo 01, and right away in the overview we see that something has changed in the connected device. We see is it has a private IP address, again here in the overview. But if we click into the settings on IP configurations, and we see what we have is the IP config, if we click into that, we see that we can actually modify the assignment of this private IP address it's getting from the IP. So we don't connected devices, of course, is again the network interface. And if we click into subnets, we see now that it's changed and says we only have 250 available IPs instead of default because one is being used by our virtual machine. Alright, gurus, we've completed our demonstration. Let's make our way back over to this creation of this virtual network. A private we want to do is create a virtual network, and we'll click next into IP addresses. And here is where we can determine to allow it and the subnet address range at 10.0.0.0/24, and then when it passes validation, we'll click back once it's finished provisioning. Alright, gurus, so we're back, and our virtual network is selected, and the DNS server in the results interface card to this virtual network. Now if we go into our settings, obviously again our address spaces that we can see, we can add additional address ranges here, then our connected devices, and then our subnets. And this is another way that we can create our subnets here. We could choose to create another subnet, and we could call this subnet, say, our web subnet here, and we can modify the subnet address range that we want to use here, and we can just click save, and there we've done adding another subnet from a different point in the interface, not necessarily something we created while we were creating the virtual network, something we created post creation of this virtual network. And these subnets are where our resources are going to exist inside of the address space when we deploy them. Now, we also see we have our DNS server settings here, and we can modify these in cases when we want to use custom DNS servers like the Google DNS servers. And if we have any virtual machines within the virtual network, they're going to have to be restarted, and then they'll be able to utilize it. And the next thing we're going to do is we're going to create a virtual machine here. We'll type in a virtual machine in this resource group we want to use here. We're going to call this the VNet by default. We're going to use the authentication type of authentication type 2 for working. And we see here we can specify the virtual network, the subnet, and we can modify the subnet, say we want to put it in a different subnet, and whether or not we want to have a public IP address associated with this virtual machine. We're going to let it go into the default subnet with a new public IP address. We'll click review and create. It'll validate. We can network in 4 virtual networks, which are 5. In total, the first and on-prem and do things like 2 CP are going to be provided unless we want to specify. We can obviously change to use custom DNS like Google DNS servers, and the DHCP is going to be built in, and we can change the assignment of private IP addresses from dynamic to static if we want to have a static private IP for our resources like our virtual machine, as we saw in our demo. Now, some additional details like we talked about are that we have new things like VPN, which we're all going to cover in a later section in this course. Then we also want to mention that virtual networks is all my time for now. Thanks so much for joining me in this lesson, and I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson. Hey, and welcome, gurus, to this lesson. routing virtual networks, where we are going to be describing what routing is and talking about the different routing types that we have in Azure Cloud. We'll discuss some different routing scenarios in which we might use routes of various types, like user-defined routes. And then we're going to go through the process of creating our own routes so that we can get used to creating routes inside of the Azure Cloud. So let's get started. Routes are the paths for connectivity within our networks. And what I mean by this is the connectivity between resource to resource within the same network, and the connectivity outbound to either peer networks and integrated network scenarios and the public internet. It's best to think of these as the paths through which traffic can flow, a lot like we have roadways and cars drive on them, and the traffic flows through the roadways that we've constructed so that we can have cars get where they need to go. They have a route to go there. Now, in the example of our virtual network, these routes work in the way of allowing, say, a virtual machine to communicate with another virtual machine inside of the same network, or allow that same virtual machine to communicate with the internet, because we have that route available, allowing that outbound traffic to flow to the internet from our virtual machine. Now, it's important to understand when we're talking about routes that we have different routing types in the Azure Cloud. We have our system routes, and these are our default routes that are built into our virtual networks, and we can't modify these. These are just routes that are built into the Azure Cloud when you're using your virtual networks. But what we can do is use custom routes to override those system routes. Our custom routes are going to be these user-defined user-defined routes, or BGP routes that are propagated from networks and integrated network scenarios. And these user-defined or BGP routes are going to override the system route. An example of system routes being overridden by custom routes can be seen here in a diagram. In our virtual networks, we're going to have outbound internet access via a route, so that connectivity exists. What we can do is create a custom route that will then block that traffic by dropping it. For example, we're going to give it a next hop of none. So in essence, we've canceled out that route because we've created a user-defined route that's going to block that route, and so it overrides the system route that allows that traffic outbound to the internet. Now let's take a look at some other routing scenarios here. Again, our user-defined routes are going to be the routes that as users we create to override those system routes, and they're going to take precedence over those routes. And an example of a routing scenario in which we're going to override the system routes are in times when we want to use a network virtual appliance like Azure Firewall, which is something we'll cover in a later lesson as its own individual resource. But let's say we want to put a firewall in place and we want to route traffic through that firewall that's going outbound to the public internet, so that then it will go to the internet, but only through this firewall. All that traffic has to pass through that firewall, so we give that route a next hop of that network virtual appliance. Now, another example of some custom routes that override our system routes are going to be our BGP routes. And again, these are the routes that are exchanged between integrated networks. So for example, in a scenario in which we have two peered virtual networks, or a hybrid network scenario between on-prem and a virtual network, we have routes that go between those networks, and these will be exchanged by those networks and override our system routes that we have in our virtual network. Now, at this point in our lesson, it's time to get into our demonstration scenario. In our demonstration, when we hop into the Azure Cloud Sandbox, we'll see that I already have a virtual network provisioned with a subnet, and inside of that subnet, I have a virtual machine, and what we're going to see is that we have the effective routes for the system routes available inside of the network interface card of that virtual machine, showing that we have that public connectivity via a route to the internet outbound from that virtual machine. And we're going to create a route table and then create a custom route on that route table that is going to block that traffic by giving it a next hop of none, so that way we can block that route and override the system routes. And then we'll take a look at the effective routes on the network interface so that we can see how that user-defined route has overridden those system routes. Alright, gurus, let's make our way into the Azure Cloud Sandbox and get started. Alright, gurus, here we are in our Azure Cloud Sandbox, and like I said, I have a virtual network here, and I have a subnet inside of this virtual network where I've deployed a virtual machine, and this virtual machine has, of course, a public IP address that came with the deployment, a disk, a network security group, and most importantly, a network interface. And this network interface is where we're going to be able to view our effective routes. So if we click into the network interface here, and if you need to set up any of those existing resources in your example for setting up your demonstration where you want to walk through, make sure to refer to the previous lessons where we talk about creating virtual networks and creating network interfaces and public IP addresses. Once you've got that set up, you're ready to begin in this demonstration. And once you're inside that network interface details on the overview, on the left-hand side, if we'll just scroll all the way down, come down to support and troubleshooting, and select our effective routes here, what we're going to see is some system routes that we have because we have not created any other routes. We have no other route table, and we have no custom defined routes. We only have the effective routes that are going to be our default system routes from our Azure Virtual Network. And what we see is that these are all the default routes, and these are all in a state of active. And we see routes like this one here that is going to provide internet access, and we also see this one here that is going to allow that route for the intra-virtual network traffic for communication between resources inside of that virtual network. Now remember, what we want to do here is create a user-defined route, a custom route that is going to allow us to actually block that internet traffic outbound. So what we're going to do is come up to the search bar, we're going to type in route tables, and we're going to select it under services. We're going to click create here, and we're going to minimize this portion of the blade. We're going to start configuring our route table by selecting our existing resource group. And then what we're going to do is make sure that we're creating our route table inside of the same region as the rest of our resources so that we don't have any issues. And I'm going to name this my route table -01. And for the propagate the gateway routes, what we're talking about here is allowing routes to be propagated whenever we have integrated networks with our virtual network. And as we can come into the one here that is going to allow that route for the intra-virtual network traffic for communication between regions. My route table, we're going to start do is make sure that we're creating our route table inside of the same region as the rest of our resources so that we don't have any issues. And I'm going to name this my route table -01, including the wildcard of 0.0 is over here to the home, and we go into our resource, have a custom route, a user-defined route that we created on our route table that we associated with our default subnet where our virtual machine has been deployed. And we're going to see that it is a user route as its source. The state is it's active. We see it has an address prefix of a wildcard for any possible addresses, and we see that its next hop is none, is now gone to a point. We finished our demonstration in creating a route table. We have our system routes in place with our virtual networks in the Azure cloud. And again, those are the default routes that are built into we are going to override our system routes. And we can override those with our custom routes. But when we're talking about those custom routes, specifically, again, are the user-defined ones we're creating. They're going to override those BGP routes.